And that brings us to the second thing I wanted to talk about, which is if in fact we are in a world where we're trying to force ourselves to think, where we're trying to learn new things, how do we maintain our focus, particularly when there are emails coming in and text messages and someone wants you to jump on a Zoom with them, they have a question they want to ask you, when there's so much overwhelming information that could distract us? How do we remain focused? And to answer that, I just wanted to tell you one more story, and this is the story about what we know about the neurology of focus. And it's the story of a plane called Qantas Flight 32. Qantas Flight 32 was a plane that took off in 2001 from Singapore headed to Sydney, Australia. And it was actually this plane. It was an Airbus A380, which I imagine many of you know about airplanes. If you've ever flown from one continent to another, you have probably flown on an Airbus A380. It's an amazing, amazing plane. It's one of those double-decker planes. It has these 4 enormous engines. Most importantly, it has an amazing onboard computer system, an autopilot navigation system that if everything goes according to plan, a pilot can fly an Airbus A380 only for about 8 minutes per flight. So about 4 minutes to take off, 4 minutes to land. The rest of the time, up to 14 hours, the plane can basically fly itself. And so on this morning that Qantas Flight 32 took off from Singapore, headed to Sydney, it was a beautiful, picture-perfect morning. There was not a cloud in the sky. And the plane travels down the runway. It lifts off into the air. The pilot, in this case, actually really, the captain, really enjoyed flying. So he flew the plane for about 12 minutes before he decided to reach over and turn on the autopilot. And as he's reaching over to turn on the autopilot, he hears this unexpected noise, like thousands of marbles being thrown against the hull or the fuselage of the plane. Now, unbeknownst to him, what had happened is a 1 in a million occurrence. Right here in this frontmost engine, there had been a buildup of grease along the axle and one of the fan blades in the jet engine. And because they were flying at a fairly low altitude and because it was very humid, there was a lot of static electricity. And that static electricity caused that grease to ignite. And it burned at a very, very hot temperature. It actually caused the fan blade to detach from the axle or the shaft. And because the jet engine was spinning so quickly when this happened, when the fan blade detached, it started shooting through the wing of the plane. Within seconds, it actually punched this hole in the top of the wing of the plane. This is actually a photo from Qantas Flight 32 that they were able to recover. I don't know what's more terrifying, being a passenger on this plane and looking out the window and seeing this enormous hole suddenly erupt in the wing right next to your window, or their first instinct is to be like, oh, look, selfie with the wing on the plane, right? I'm gonna take a picture of that hole. But regardless, we have the photo. Now, what's interesting is this is not the bad thing that happened to Qantas Flight 32. Because Qantas Flight 32, an Airbus A380, it's such a sophisticated plane that even after an injury like this, the plane can continue flying no problem for about 8 more hours. The onboard computer can make accommodations for the changes in airflow and speed and injury and continue flying that plane, no issue. The bad thing that happened to Qantas Flight 32 is what happened next. Because when that fan blade detached, another 1 in a million occurrence happened. It hit another fan blade. And those fan blades are designed to break into big chunks so that they're not dangerous. But there is this one angle of incidence that if it gets hit at exactly the wrong spot in the wrong way, the fan blade can explode into thousands of pieces. And that's what happened here. And so those thousands of pieces, as they started moving through the wing of the plane, it was like the shrapnel from a bomb. It started cutting through hydraulics lines and fuel lines and electrical lines. Richard de Crespigny sitting in the cockpit as he's reaching over to the captain, whose name is Richard de Crespigny, as he's reaching over to turn on the autopilot, he suddenly sees his entire dashboard light up with alarms. It would later be deemed the worst mechanical mid-air disaster in modern aviation. And so the captain, Richard de Crespigny, when they eventually were able to look at the plane on the ground, it looked like someone had sprayed it with bullets. Richard de Crespigny is this guy, the captain of the plane. And as Richard de Crespigny, as he's reaching over and these alarms start going on, he has this kind of interesting dilemma, which is, what is he going to do? Now, Richard de Crespigny, he had actually been trained to fly by the Australian Air Force. And I don't know if there's any Air Force vets in the audience, but if there is, or if you know an Air Force vet, what you know is that whenever you're trained to fly by any kind of military Air Force, you're taught a very specific way of thinking, particularly in cases of emergency. Within aviation, this is known as situational awareness, and most of us are aware of this phrase, situational awareness. It actually comes from aviation, and it has a very specific meaning in the aviation. It's a way of training people to think, a way of training people to maintain their focus by teaching them to build mental models about what's going on as it occurs. Because one of the things that we know is, if we tell ourselves stories about what we expect to see, what we expect is going to happen, it makes it easier for our brain to decide what to pay attention to and what to ignore by comparing what's actually occurring to the story that's inside of our own head. Many of you already do this, right? We all do this at some level. If we have a big, tough conversation coming up, we start playing it over in our head to prepare for it. And that's because our brain wants to train us to learn to pay attention to the important things that really matter to us. There was actually a study that was done of Fortune 500 executives where they were trying to figure out why some executives got promoted faster than their peers, what they had in common. What they discovered is that there was really only one habit that everyone who did well seemed to have in common, which is that they tended to visualize their days with a little bit more specificity than everyone else. They would tell themselves stories about what was going to happen that day more than everyone else. So most of us think, I'm going to a meeting at 10 o'clock. I got to bring that folder. I got to be out of there by 10:45. But the people who tended to get promoted the fastest, they would say, oh, I'm going to that meeting at 10 o'clock. You know what? It's going to start with Jim bringing up that dumb idea he always brings up. And then Susie's going to disagree with him because there's something weird going on there. She disagrees with them all the time, but I'm just going to let them fight it out. And then when they're done fighting, I'm going to jump in with my idea and I'm going to win the meeting. This act of visualizing their days with just a little bit more specificity, telling themselves a story about what's about to happen, that seemed to give these executives a leg up. And Richard de Crespigny, the captain of this plane, he loved this stuff. Just that morning, when they were taking a shuttle from the hotel to the airport before the flight, he went through a ritual that he went through before every single flight. He turned to his co-pilots and he said, tell me a story about what's going to happen if engine 2 goes out. Where are your eyes going to go first? What are the first words out of your mouth? If we lose engine 3, what are you going to do with your hands? And in fact, if you listen to the cockpit recording of Qantas Flight 32, in the minutes after that hole appeared in that wing, what you hear on that recording are all the pilots speaking to each other in these short, clipped, totally unpanicked sentences. There's not an ounce of concern in their voice. It's as if they're reading from a script, as if they practiced this 1,000 times, which of course they have practiced this 1,000 times, right? They practiced it just that morning. And in 99% of cases, that would have saved everyone on board. But not this time. Because the problem with Qantas Flight 32 is there are so many things wrong with this flight that as soon as they solve one problem, they follow the script and they figure out a solution, 10 more problems pop up. And then they solve 2 of those. Now they've got 20 new emergencies. Everything is falling apart. Everything is coming up, is not working on this flight. And so in this moment of crisis, about 10 minutes into this emergency, Richard de Crespigny, the captain, does this incredibly strange thing. With all the alarms going off, with everyone starting to panic around him, he takes his hands off of the yoke, off of the controls. He puts them in his lap, and he closes his eyes. And he thinks to himself, up until now, I have been telling myself a story about an Airbus A380. I've been trying to keep track of the fuel flows and what's working and what isn't, and where the hydraulics are going. And I'm feeling overwhelmed. I'm feeling completely overcome by this. I need to change the story inside my head to something that's more comfortable, something that's simpler, that's something I can keep track of. And so in a split second, he decides, I'm going to change the story in my head to the plane that I am most comfortable flying, the plane that I learned to fly on. I am going to start pretending that I am flying a Cessna. Now, I imagine a number of you have flown in Cessnas before, so you know that if you were to put an Airbus A380 and a Cessna next to each other, it would not look like this, right? It would look like this. Comparing a Cessna and an A380 is like comparing like a Lamborghini and a bicycle. They have almost nothing in common. It's laughable. Except that a Cessna has the basics of flight, right? It has the ability to go up and down in the air. It has landing gear. It has a navigation system. But that's what Duhigg decides. I'm going to pretend I'm flying a Cessna. So by now, they've managed to turn the plane around and they're headed back to the Singapore airport. And as they start to approach, air traffic control comes on and they know the emergency that they're having. And they say the thing that ATC is never supposed to say. They say, according to our computers, at the rate of speed that you're approaching, if you land, there's a chance that you'll land too fast and heavy and that your wheels will explode and that you will crash. And Richard de Crespigny reaches over, he turns on his microphone so it's just him, and he says to air traffic control, "Don't worry about it, I've got this, I'm flying a Cessna, we're fine." Turns off the microphone, and his co-pilots are like freaking out in the background because they have no idea what he's talking about. And so they're approaching the runway, and they touch down, and the wheels don't explode. But now they've got another problem. Which is they don't know if their brakes work. And if their brakes do work, they don't even know if they have a long enough runway to stop. So Richard de Crespigny decides in a split second to follow his habits that he had learned when he was flying Cessnas, which is they tell you if you're flying a Cessna and you have an emergency landing, here's how you brake. Pick up your foot as high as you can, press the brake pedal down, keep it pressed down, and then pray. And that's exactly what he does. He presses the brake pedal down, and you can actually hear on the cockpit recording, hear him muttering the Lord's Prayer. And again, his co-pilots are freaking out. And the brakes, they start to catch. There's some juice there. But now they have to figure out, is the runway long enough that they're going to be able to stop the plane before they get to the end of the runway? Because at the end of the runway is a huge sand dune. And if they crash into that, things aren't going to be good. And so the plane is speeding down the runway, and de Crespigny is trying to brake it, and they can hear the plane groaning as it's trying to cascade speed. The wings are groaning. Then they feel themselves starting to get slower, but they don't know if they're getting slower enough. And they see the end of the runway getting closer and closer and closer, and the plane is slowing down, but it's not slowing down quite as quickly as they had hoped. And the dune's getting closer and closer, and then they stop with 100 meters to spare. 49 minutes later, all 469 people on board that plane walked off without one injury. There was literally not so much as a sprained thumb. And eventually they started asking, why? Why was Richard de Crespigny able to land this plane when it seemed so hopeless? And so they asked him. I've asked him. I've talked to him half a dozen times. And if you ask him, what he'll tell you is he has no idea. He doesn't know what he did. His habits took over. But he does know that he made one really important decision, which is that he decided to start pretending he was flying a Cessna. Because when he did that, it made him feel like he was back in control. It made him feel like he was making choices, that rather than reacting to the alarms, rather than reacting to the emergency, he decided to change the story in his head. And something about that change, even though it was a ridiculous change, even though it made no sense, something about that made him feel like he was in control and let his habits come out in the most productive way possible. And this is what we know about focus. We know that focus is visualizing what ought to happen and then having some way of challenging that story inside your head when you need to. And I'm not going to tell you that your office is like the cockpit of a plane that's about to crash, but it's probably not that different, right? When you're sitting at home, you've got 10 Zoom calls and you've got 20 emails and you've got someone calling you and you've got someone texting you. You can become overwhelmed. You can become reactive. And so the question is, how do you challenge yourself? How do you challenge that story inside your head? How do you change it so that you are following the path that you believe you ought to, instead of reacting to those alarms?